Good morning, everyone. And now, most of my lectures that I give on cruises are pretty much pure natural history. That's what I'm sort of brought on for. But every once in a while, I do like to give a lecture that mixes natural history with human history. And the gentleman sitting in this portrait at this nice tropical table somewhere around New Guinea with a couple of birds of paradise waiting to be prepared and notes to be taken is an excellent choice for someone to combine those two subjects. A really remarkable man, and one who I don't think is as well known. Every biologist knows who Alfred Russel Wallace was. But he's not that well known to the general public, and I'm just kind of curious. I mean, Australians maybe know him better than North Americans. I know that Tom and Phil and some others have mentioned Wallace in some of their lectures, but leaving that aside, before you came on this cruise, how many people here had heard of or knew who Alfred Russel Wallace was before they came on this trip? Just a very few. That's kind of too bad, because he was one of the amazing people of the 19th century. So anyway, since most of you don't know who he was, this is a good slide to start with. Who was Alfred Russel Wallace? Well, he was born in Wales in 1823. Now, before I get any further, are there any people in here from Wales? Oh dear. I was hoping I was going to get away with this. I'm going to suggest that the name of that town is something like Llanbadog. Am I anywhere near close? Good, amazing, wow. Anyway, he was born in Wales, and his family was middle class and didn't have very much money. And that is actually very important for what happened to Wallace in his later life. In the 19th century, there really wasn't a paid profession of being a scientist or a zoologist. In fact, the word scientist didn't even exist really until about the middle of the 19th century. So if you wanted to devote your life to traveling around the world, studying natural history, the best way to set yourself up for it was to make sure that you were born with money. And for instance, Charles Darwin was quite a wealthy man. One of his grandparents was Josiah Wedgwood of the Wedgwood Pottery Empire. So he didn't have to worry. He could do all this sort of stuff whenever he wanted. But Wallace couldn't. Wallace had to work for a living. And that made his chosen profession rather tough. He started out being trained as a land surveyor, got used to traveling around the countryside, but he was inspired by his readings of, well, Darwin being one of them, and Humboldt, the famous German explorer and naturalist, also inspired him, and he wanted to follow in their footsteps. But in order to travel, he couldn't just bop around the world, sort of as Darwin did, as the sort of conversation companion of the captain of the Beagle. He had to work his way, and the way he did it was by collecting specimens, which he would then send back and sell to museums or private collectors in England. And that was how he funded his travels. That's what you had to do if you were in his position. So his first big trip abroad was to the Amazon, and he spent 4 years not only collecting natural history specimens, but mapping the rivers, mapping the Rio Negro, which is one of the major tributaries of the Amazon, and collecting wildlife, noting down information about plants as well, and about the people. He was very interested in the societies he was passing through. Now, he arrived in the Amazon in the company of another famous Victorian naturalist, Henry Walter Bates, who we'll talk about a little in my next lecture on butterflies. And Wallace recorded, he got there, it was with deep interest that my companion and myself both now about to see and examine the beauties of a tropical country for the first time, gazed on the land where I at least eventually spent 11 of the best years of my life. He liked it there. And he took very careful notes on all his specimens. These are drawings he made of freshwater fishes. There's an enormous freshwater fish fauna in the Amazon, its tributaries, hundreds of species. These are 2 species of catfish that he drew himself. And he spent years traveling up and down into the Rio Negro. Bates also spent about 11 years there. But Wallace, when he eventually went back, he had a real tragedy for him. Remember, he made his money selling specimens to museums. He had already sent a lot of things off, but for his final voyage home, he packed up all his remaining specimens in wooden crates, shipped them off, and his ship sank. And he was stuck out in the middle of the Atlantic. His ship had caught fire. He and his companions had to spend 10 days in an open boat in the middle of the ocean before they were rescued, but his specimens were irretrievably lost, and any income he would have earned from them. So he began to think, where could he go next to finance his traveling and zoological interests, and he looked east. He looked to the country that we're going through right now, what he called the Malay Archipelago. That was the title of his book, one of the most wonderful travel and nature books ever written. The Malay Archipelago, the land of the orangutan and the bird of paradise, a narrative of travel with studies of man and nature. Today we usually just call it the Malay Archipelago. We're not much for long titles. And he loved it there. He called it the very finest field for an exploring and collecting naturalist to be found in the great Malayan archipelago. And that was where he made his name. He spent time on Borneo, where he was the guest of the first Raja of Sarawak. And I have to tell you a little bit about that, partly because it's interesting, second because my wife comes from Sarawak, and I've spent quite a bit of time there as a result. Sarawak is a very unusual place. It's now a state of Malaysia in North Borneo, but it came into existence really largely because this Englishman named James Brooke sailed up the Rajang River in Sarawak after coming over from Singapore to trade in antimony, ended up getting involved in a war between the local sultan and the river pirates on the river, what he called pirates, helped defeat them, and the sultan awarded him the title of the Raja of Sarawak. And for 100 years, he and his family, the Brooke family, ran Sarawak as their own private kingdom. They were called the White Rajas, and much to my surprise, when I first visited Malaysia, they were revered. They were thought of as being honest, honorable people who wanted the best for the society, didn't try and enrich themselves. Very interesting history. But anyway, Brooke attracted a lot of naturalists who he invited to come out and spend time with him to study the natural history of Borneo, and Wallace was one of them. One of the species he found, that's his drawing of it, is now known as Wallace's flying frog. You see those huge webbed feet. It can actually jump out of a tree, spread its toes like this, and glide, and can actually control its path of flight to the next tree. As you can see from this photo, one time I did get to see Wallace's flying frog. It's quite a magnificent creature, beautiful animal. He also had an inspiration. He was thinking about the huge diversity of wildlife that he had seen in the Amazon and that he had also seen in Borneo, in the Malay Archipelago. So he asked himself where all these things came from. Now, at that time, the idea that evolution was happening wasn't really that much of a surprise to most of the people in the scientific community. This was even well before the origin of species. The question wasn't, did things evolve? Because most educated people agreed that it probably did, but how? But he noticed that every species has come into existence coincident both in space and time with a pre-existing closely allied species. In other words, you have a species and it splits into two populations. One becomes a different species. This is a different species. So you now have the ancestor having formed two coincident species living at the same time. And he wrote a paper about this while he was in Sarawak, so that is now called the Sarawak Law. Nothing to do with the actual legal system in Sarawak. It was just the rule that Wallace formulated, and it began to give people in Europe some notice of his scientific abilities. He moved on from Borneo east, down into the islands well east of where we've already been, east of Timor, into the Moluccas. And there he made some more fascinating discoveries that today bear his name. This bird particularly, of course, remember, he wasn't looking at these things through binoculars, he was shooting them. Yeah, that's how you got specimens in those days to sell. So when he brought this bird down, he was utterly astonished. This weird creature. This is Wallace's standard-wing bird of paradise, and it's only found in the Moluccas. He said, when he saw his specimen, I now saw that I had got a great prize, no less than a completely new form of the bird of paradise, differing most remarkably from every other known bird. And it is. It's a strange creature with these weird white feathers growing out from under its wings. This was in the Moluccas, which are volcanic islands. You can see the picture down there. This one, frankly, almost killed him. This is the golden birdwing butterfly, or Wallace's golden birdwing. And birdwing butterflies can be very hard to catch. And, you know, a gun is not a whole lot of use in bringing them down. It's possible, mind you. So he was always trying to net these things for specimens. And he finally did manage to catch one of these golden birdwings, and he records what the experience did to him. He said, on taking it out of my net and opening the glorious wings, my heart began to beat violently. The blood rushed to my head, and I felt much more like fainting than I've done when in apprehension of immediate death. I had a headache for the rest of the day. So he was really pretty impressed with bird wings. And it's understandable, because bird wings are pretty impressive. Here are 4 species from New Guinea. Now, we had another one in Cairns. Actually, one of them tried to fly onto the ship when we were there. Magnificent, the largest butterflies in the world, brilliantly colored. The males, the females perhaps less so, but even bigger than the males. Stunning colors. This one is the biggest butterfly in the world. This is Queen Alexandra's birdwing. It's found only in one little valley in New Guinea, but people raise them commercially to sell as specimens to collectors. Now, you may look at this. This is a male, and you say, wait a minute, that doesn't really look to me like the biggest butterfly in the world. But you haven't seen the female yet. There's the female. That is a big butterfly. He moved on to the island of Ternate, another of the Molucca Islands, and here something happened to him that changed his life forever, and his reputation forever. He got sick. He came down with malaria in January 1858. And while he was sick, of course, he couldn't do any collecting or anything like that, but once he started getting a little better, he could do a lot of thinking about what he'd seen, about what he had discovered and found. And while recovering, he suddenly had a flash of inspiration about how all these creatures had come to be. He said, it occurred to me to ask the question, why do some die, some species, some forms of life, and others live? And the answer was clearly that on the whole, the best fitted live. Survival of the fittest. You've heard that phrase before. Well, he thought this was a wonderful stroke of inspiration. So he wrote an essay on this idea, sort of spelled it out a little bit, just about 10, 20-page essay. He said, you know, here I am in Ternate in the Moluccas. I'm on the other side of the world from England, but I really need to get somebody to look at this and tell me if I've got what they think of my idea. So he decided to send it to a famous naturalist in England to ask, gee, do you think this is a good idea? Well, of course, no surprise, the famous naturalist was Charles Darwin. Now, he sent this off in January, rough January, February. Now, this was before the days of email, and so messages took a long time to get anywhere. So Darwin, here he is here, didn't get Wallace's letter until several months later. He got it in June 1858, and when he read it, he was absolutely horror-stricken. He was absolutely in a panic. He had been working on basically the same idea for 20 years. Darwin was an extremely methodical scientist. He never felt he was ready to publish anything. He felt he needed more evidence. And he had worked on this for decades now, building up to publishing something on this same idea. And in fact, his big plan was for a huge 3-volume monograph that was going to contain all the evidence he collected. But he felt Wallace had now beat him to it. Wallace had scooped him after all those years of work. He was in despair. And his friends, who were a lot more aggressive than Darwin was a very shy man, said, what are you talking about? This guy got an idea in the East Indies. You know, you've been working on it for 20 years. You're going to say he now gets the credit and you don't. They said, you've got to publish, and publish now. So His friends persuaded him to do it, but Darwin said, no, I won't do it unless I can share credit with Wallace. He deserves it. So they then proceeded. Of course, Wallace was still off in the Moluccas, to publish. The way they published, as they often did in those days, is they wrote up some short essays on their ideas and read them at a meeting of a very prestigious organization, the Linnean Society of London. And Darwin didn't go to the meeting. Darwin, again, was very shy. He didn't want to do this. It was his friends that went there. So they went off to have this meeting, and you can see here, if you can just read a little of this, is the results of the investigations of two indefatigable naturalists, Mr. Charles Darwin and Mr. Alfred Wallace. These gentlemen, having independently and unknown to one another conceived the same very ingenious theory to account for the appearance and perpetuation of varieties and of specific forms on our planet, may both fairly claim the merit of being original thinkers in this important line of inquiry, but neither of them having published his views, though Mr. Darwin for many years had been repeatedly urged by us to do so, and both authors having now unreservedly placed their papers in our hands, we think it would be best to promote the interests of science that a selection of them should be read to the Linnean Society. So that was their explanation. And Darwin gave up his idea, again persuaded of his 3-volume monograph, and said, all right, okay, I'll do a 1-volume abstract, a condensation, a boil down of my ideas in a book about that thick, and that became the most famous probable book published in the 19th century, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, to give the full title, or The Preservation of Favored Races and the Struggle for Life. The Origin of Species became the biggest bestseller of Victorian times, and he did make a specific point of crediting Wallace in the opening. He referred to Wallace's excellent memoir. Wallace was still overseas, but when Wallace returned, he, instead of being concerned about all this, became one of Darwin's biggest defenders and spoke out in behalf of his ideas and was quite happy to let Darwin take most of the credit. But Wallace had been thinking about something else at the same time, something, again, that he had noticed in his travels in the East Indies that he couldn't quite understand. He visited the island of Bali, where we are going, and you see right across from the island of Bali is another island called Lombok. And Wallace visited both of those islands, and he noticed that there were some very strong differences in the animals that he found on Bali and the animals he found on Lombok, and he couldn't understand why they were so different from each other. These two islands are in sight of each other. So he wrote to Henry Walter Bates, the scientist who he had traveled with to the Amazon. He said, two distinct faunas, rigidly circumscribed, which differ as much as do those of Africa and South America, and more than those of Europe and North America. Yet there's nothing on the map or on the face of these islands to mark their limits. The boundary line passes between these islands closer together than others belonging in the same group. In other words, there were islands that were further away from Lombok than Bali was, that had animals similar to Lombok, but not the things on Bali. What was going on? Why were these two islands so different? Here's an example of how different they were. The animal on the left is a tree shrew. Tree shrews are distant relatives of primates that are very common in Southeast Asia. They look rather like some kind of squirrel, and they range down through Thailand, down into Malaysia, down through Sumatra and Java and Borneo, and as far east as Bali, and no further. No more easterly island has them. The bird on the left is a honey eater, a bird on Lombok. This is an enormous family of birds that are many, many species in Australia and New Guinea and islands in the eastern part of Indonesia today. And the honey eater gets as far as Lombok, and no honey eater is found further west. What on earth was going on here? Bali had all kinds of things that weren't on Lombok. Bali, in Wallace's day, had tigers. There was a special form of tiger on Bali. It's extinct now. This is, as far as we know, the only photograph of a living Balinese tiger. It was in the Ringling Brothers Circus. But tigers range as far west as Central Asia, all the way down through Asia, down through Southeast Asia, into Sumatra, Java, Bali, never Borneo, strangely enough. But no further east. They stopped there. They disappeared in Bali back in the 40s, and by the 70s they were gone from Java as well, but still that was as far as they'd gotten. And that's not the only cat. This one, the leopard cat, the Sunda leopard cat, also ranges through Sumatra and Java and Bali and stops. Nothing further east. Why? By the way, just a little bit of a detour. This is the one bird that is only found on Bali. It's the Bali starling. It's critically endangered because it's been massively trapped for the pet trade. It's only today found in the extreme northwest corner of Bali. It's the only bird entirely restricted to Bali. It's been trapped, as I say, for the cage bird trade, which is a huge problem in Indonesia. There's almost every cage bird, their songbird you see ends up getting trapped and stuck in a cage in Indonesia. There are thousands of them on sale in markets. But by 2001, there were only 6 of these left, and they've been now bred up in captivity. There's about 1,000 of them in captivity still, and there have been attempts to reintroduce wild birds back to Bali. Part of the problem is as soon as they reintroduced the birds into Bali, the poachers came and trapped them again. But there are about 50 of them in the wild now up in Bali Barat National Park, which is at the extreme western end of Bali. So they're still poaching. It's still a big problem to try and control them. But that, again, is something that only is found on Bali. So why wasn't it on Lombok also? It's close enough. So Wallace decided that there was a boundary. Somewhere you could draw a line, sort of an imaginary line, through the East Indies, to the east of Borneo and Bali, but to the west of Lombok and Celebes, which is now Sulawesi. And that was the dividing point where you had between the Asian fauna and the Australian or Australasian fauna. And he didn't call it Wallace's line. Someone else coined that name later, but it's always referred to as Wallace's line today. And he came up with that line in 1863 between the Indo-Malayan and the Austro-Malayan regions, as he called them. And he wrote, "The whole of the islands eastward from Java and Borneo do essentially form a part of a former Australian or Pacific continent from which they were separated before the extreme southeast portion of Asia was raised above the waters of the ocean." That was his idea, that all of the Malaysian side had been underwater. And that's why animals from Southeast Asia had not been able to reach these eastern islands, which were more getting their fauna from Australia. Now, that was not a bad idea for Wallace in his time based on what he knew, but it still left the problem of how on earth did that happen? How could that happen? And that became a subject of contention for many, many years. And one of the most unfortunate, I think, people to deal with this was this man, Alfred Wegener, who's a German scientist. He was interested in the same problem on a global scale. He noticed, for instance, that Africa and South America could be fitted together as though they were pieces in a jigsaw puzzle. So he came up with the idea of continental drift, that the continents actually moved around the earth, and that sometimes they were all joined together, and at other times they were separate from each other. And that was one of the reasons why you had different faunas on one continent and on another, because when they formed, those continents might have been very far apart from each other and not as close as they are today. The problem was that he couldn't explain how this could possibly happen. How could continents drift through the solid rock of the Earth's crust? It just seemed impossible. It seemed ridiculous. And Wegener was pilloried by the scientific community. His ideas were just completely rejected. And he really had it just really wrecked a lot of his career. He, in fact, later disappeared in an expedition in the Arctic. But the point is, he was sort of right. And the person who carried that over and figured out what was really going on was this man, whom I do feel I have to show you because he's a Canadian as I am, and I've got some point or other I have to say things like that. This was John Tutso Wilson. He was a professor at the University of Toronto, and in the 1950s, he was a pioneer in the study of plate tectonics. Now, you've heard about those in other lectures. This is the idea. It's not that the continents are drifting through solid rock. What is happening is that big plates of the Earth's crust in which the continents are embedded are moving around relation to each other and dragging the continents along with them. And when he proposed this idea in the 50s, Tutso Wilson was criticized as heavily as Wegener had been. The difference is they now had data. They had information from the first soundings of the bottoms of the ocean to show that they could even find places like the mid-Atlantic ridge on the middle of the Atlantic where you could actually see the formations of new edges of the plates. You could actually measure the movement of them. So after a while, people realized that Tutso-Wilson was right, and that what was happening was that these plates were sliding under and over each other as they moved, being carried by currents in the Earth's crust. And so Australasia and Southeast Asia started out, but at the point we're talking about, a very long way from each other, much further apart than they are today. And their distinct faunas and biotas, the plant life, evolved when they were way far away from each other, not almost next to each other. And that it's been the movement of the Earth's plates that has brought them closer and closer together, so that a plate with a mass of Australian animals was brought up until it hit a plate with a lot of Asian animals on it, and the two ended up very close together, but with a deep open ocean trench between them. And that was the explanation for what Wallace had trying to understand back in the 19th century. Even over a few million years, they moved much, much closer together. Well, there's been a lot of debate about how accurate Wallace's original description of all this was. It wasn't completely true that the faunas of places like Bali were totally, absolutely different from the faunas of places like Lombok. It was that there were certain things on each island that were not on the other one. He pointed out some other examples. For instance, Bali has woodpeckers and their relatives. He talked about the barbets, which are relative woodpeckers. The whole woodpecker group is totally absent from Australia and all the surrounding islands. But cockatoos are found on Lombok, but they don't get over into Bali. So that's another example of the same thing. He said in Bali, we have barbets, fruit thrushes, and woodpeckers. On passing over to Lombok, these are seen no more, but we have an abundance of cockatoos, honeysuckers, that's the honey eaters I talked to you about earlier, and brush turkeys. These are these chicken-like birds that build these huge mounds in which they incubate their eggs. But it's not entirely that way. There are monkeys on Lombok. Monkeys are Asian animals, not Australian. They're not in Australia. Its mammals, in fact, are really more like Asia's than they are like Australia's. So it's not as crisp a division as Wallace might have originally implied. It has deer. It has pangolins, these Asian scaly anteater-like creatures. None of which are Australasian. They're all Asian animals, and none of which get much further east. And it doesn't have marsupials, the group of animals that we think of as primarily the main group of Australasian mammals. They don't get to Lombok. So it's not quite as neat as that. And so as a result, various later scientists began to think, well, maybe Wallace drew his line in the wrong place, or maybe it's more of a less of a line than a smudge, perhaps. So you have Thomas Henry Huxley in 1868, who decided that the Philippines should be on the Australasian side of the line instead of the Asian side. Various other things. And you can see when you look at the map, the continental shelves are still pretty far apart from each other. So how all these little islands collected their different faunas was partly over the ocean, not just by being able to walk there on former continents. So in the mid-19th century, there were a lot of efforts to define where did Asia stop and Australasia start, which was Wallace's question. And it wasn't exact. And some islands have a mixture of both. They were getting things from both sides of the line. So where do you draw this line? That became a bit of a quandary at that time. One of the islands that had people puzzled was the island of Celebes, or what we now call Sulawesi. Celebes has, on the right here, a babirusa, which is a kind of pig. A very odd pig that's only found in Sulawesi. So that's an Asian animal. It also has this animal, the cuscus, which is a marsupial. So that's an animal that got there via Australasia. They're both on the same island of Celebes. It has monkeys. It has unique monkeys like the black macaque, but it also has birds like this maleo, another of the brush turkey, mound builder, Australasian type of birds, both on the island of Sulawesi. Philippines has sort of a combination of all three. You have a cockatoo, which is an Australasian bird. You have a tarsier, that is not Yoda. Tarsiers are a kind of primate, so they're more of an Asian animal, and it has butterflies like this that range across the whole area: Asia, Asia, Australia, both places. So where are the Philippines? Are they Asian or are they Australian? And of course, the other thing is that animals can move by themselves. They can get from one island to another under their own steam. The saltwater crocodile, for example, can swim pretty well throughout the Indonesian archipelago. Here's you see the orange is the range of the saltwater crocodile, and you're the estuarine crocodile, and you can see they go to India, Sri Lanka, and all the way down to the Solomon Islands and Australia, right across this so-called division between Asia and Australia. The division doesn't mean anything to them. They swim. Even smaller animals, jezebels, are a group of butterflies that, it's actually one of the largest groups of butterflies in the world. There's about 300 or more species of them. And again, they range from Asia down into Australia, and just different species all the way along. These are photographs I took of 3 species on Borneo. These were actually all in the same bunch of flower bushes, the 3 different species of Jezebel on Borneo. But there are hundreds of these things throughout this entire region. So again, butterflies obviously can fly. So later scientists began to say, okay, what are we going to do about Wallace's line? Well, let's use some different criteria, some of them said. Max Wilhelm Karl Weber, a German scientist, built a line you can see that goes east of Timor and east of Sulawesi. He based it on what he called faunal balance. Like, where would you draw the line that's sort of between the islands that are kind of like half and half? If this is 20% Asian and 80% Malaysian, and the other side it's vice versa, where can we put the line in the middle so it separates at the point, like a continental divide, you might think about it, where half of them are one, half of them are the other. Richard Lydekker, an English scientist, used a different plan. He decided that he would forget about the animals and follow the line of the Australian continental shelf. So you have Lydecker's line, which is even further east and follows mostly the the continental shelf of Australasia. Anyway, Wallace, though, went on to develop his ideas into a whole new branch of science. This was probably his #1 contribution today, other than what he did with Darwin. It was the science that we today call biogeography, or for animals, zoogeography. How animals and plants are distributed in different parts of the world. And Wallace took a look at the map of the world and said, okay, well, let's ignore the continental boundaries. Look at where you have a changeover from one set of animals and plants to another. And he divided the world up into a series of biogeographical regions. So in North America is the Nearctic, or the New World, so it's the New North, the New Arctic. To the south of it is the Neotropical, the New Tropics. Then you have the Palearctic, which is most of Europe and most of Asia and North Africa. That means the Old Arctic. You have the Ethiopian region, which is Africa, south of the Sahara, including Madagascar, the Oriental, and then the Australasian regions. And this was a very, very important discovery, that faunas and floras would develop independently in each of these regions, of course from common ancestors eventually, and that they would characterize, so you don't find African animals in South America or Australian animals in North America, except in a few exceptions. But basically speaking, this division has lasted more or less intact to this day. There are some people who modify it a bit, maybe split Madagascar off, but this idea of Wallace's is still the main theory as to animal distribution and plant distribution in the world today. So Wallace left behind him a considerable legacy, and it's much broader than I've touched on. Wallace was a very diverse and intelligent man. He wrote over 20 books and over 700 articles in the course of his life. He lived a long time. He died in 1913. As I mentioned, he shares credit with Darwin for the theory of natural selection. He founded the science of animal distribution, zoogeography, the thing I showed you on the last map. He also was interested in social issues. He was an early supporter of women's right to vote, and campaigned for women's suffrage in England, and also for other social issues at the time. So he wasn't just interested in science. He investigated and thought about all sorts of things. He became a spiritualist late in life, which you'd say more or less whether that's a good thing or not, but he was interested in the possibility of an afterlife. He wrote a book about whether there could be life on other planets like Mars, which, remember, this is in the late 19th century. And he came to the conclusion that probably not. And for that, actually, he got criticized by a number of people who felt that he had underestimated the possibility of life on other planets, one of whom was Mark Twain. And that resulted in Wallace getting maybe the ultimate pop accolade for our time. He was mentioned on Star Trek. If you remember this, if you're at all fans, there's an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation in which our heroes go back to early 19th century United States and meet Mark Twain. And when we first come across Mark Twain, he is busily chomping on his cigar and telling anyone who listened how silly he thought Alfred Russel Wallace's ideas about life on other planets were. So that's about a 10-minute sequence, a 5-10 minute sequence when he's talking about the distinguished natural philosopher Alfred Russel Wallace. But I think for biologists, the ultimate tribute to Wallace comes from the lands we're sailing through now. Because for a biologist, that whole area of the world between where Wallace drew his line in the west and Lydecker drew his line in the east, this whole area where the faunas merge and mix and blend into each other, and you find that division between Australia and Asia, to a naturalist, to a biologist, that has only one name, and the name is Wallacea. And it's still called that today. And that brings me to the end of my lecture, so thank you very much for listening. And I'll say one, to those of you leaving us in Bali, have a safe flight home, and thank you very much for coming.